Good evening, everyone. My name is John Walker, and I'm sitting with Bruce Wasick virtually, as well as other brothers and sisters in this Zoom chat as we are virtual during this time. Welcome back to our study of the Book of Origins, Genesis, and our brother and teacher Bruce Wasick will pick up where we left off earlier in the year. With that, I will ask Bruce, where are we in our study?
We're at the last major transition point in the book of Genesis. We're moving into the last significant narrative story, which primarily concerns the figure of Joseph. But we're dealing tonight with some transitional material, which may seem odd to us, but we'll hopefully try to make sense of it. We're actually going to cover 3 chapters. And the first chapter we're going to cover is chapter 36. And here's how we're going to cover it. It's a chapter filled with genealogies of Esau and the Edomites. That's what I'm going to tell you about it. All I can say is that, so why this lengthy chapter with all this material about Esau and his descendants? Well, that's because God had made a covenant promise to Abraham to bless his descendants. And Esau, as well as Jacob, were children of that promise. And so they were blessed too, although the chosen line went through Jacob rather than Esau. But the biblical text is trying to say God didn't forget Esau. Matter of fact, a whole nation was formed out of his descendants, and they had kings. And even before Israel had a king, they had a king. And so he's telling us all this material to let us know God didn't forget his promise and his renewal of covenant with Isaac, and then with finally now Jacob. So that's chapter 36. And then we begin, an introduction is chapter 37, related to the Joseph narrative. And then there's an interlude in chapter 38, which we'll get to in a little bit and discuss. So John, if you'd like to get us started in chapter 37.
Thank you, Bruce. Beginning chapter 37, verse 1. Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any other of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out of the field, when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." When he had told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Bruce, what generational dysfunction do we see here?
Yeah, so we see this enmity that's based upon preferential treatment by the father. He clearly shows that he loves Joseph more than his older brothers or sisters. And this preferential treatment creates tremendous hostility and is going to lead to an extreme situation. And the roots of this are all the way back to Jacob's childhood as well, when his father preferred his brother Esau, and his mother Rebekah preferred him. And so you had this rivalry between he and his brother as he stole blessings from his brother and deceived his brother, deceived his father. So all this conniving and things, of course, led in Jacob's life. He had to run for his life because his brother Esau said he was going to kill him. So this sibling rivalry, stoked by bad parenting, by preferential treatment of one child over another, is a multi-generational problem for the family. And so it stands as, I think, a stark warning to us. But the interesting thing is that, of course, if you were just making this story up, if it wasn't a real story of real people, you would certainly want to make people look more noble than they look in these verses. But the Bible is not about a made-up story. These are real people. And we realize that real people sometimes inherit a dysfunctional way of forming family, and it impacts multi-generations. And so that's what occurs here. And as we look at it, Joseph didn't do anything to make things better. First of all, he was, I don't know whether he's a tattletale on his brothers, or we don't call it that. The brothers probably would have called it that, gave a bad report to their father, or he may have just viewed it as just giving an honest report to his dad that he felt like that whatever it was, we don't know what it was, that his brothers were not doing what they should do. This caused them to intensely hate him. And the word here in the Hebrew is not just they're frustrated, they're irritated. This is a militant word. They hated his guts. This was a hate waiting for an opportunity. As someone has said, it's like a stringed bow with an arrow in it, stretched taut. And all you can do is just wait for when you're going to release the arrow and the bow, and it's going to spring because of this extreme hatred they had for their brother. So to make things better, Joseph couldn't wait to tell the dreams he was having at night. And he told, of course, two separate dreams, but they all kind of had the same theme. The first one was an agricultural setting with the sheaves that after they had the harvest all laid on the ground. But then one sheaf, which was Joseph, stood up, and all the others remained of the 11 bowed down to him. And of course, his brothers instantly said, "So you're going to reign over us? You're going to be a ruler over us?" And of course, you can imagine how ludicrous that must have seemed to these older brothers of their young brother. He's going to rule over us. Well, he's way down the line in terms of getting the family responsibility. And of course, we know more of the story, and we see these were clearly divine dreams given to Joseph. And of course, God did reveal himself in a variety of different ways. And dreams was one of the ways that God communicated with people. And so he couldn't wait to tell his story, but of course, it just stirred up more animosity. And even his father got upset at the second dream, where he saw the moon and the sun showing homage to him and 11 stars, all of them bowing down. And his father rebuked him as well. This is, this isn't a smart thing to be saying. It just antagonizes everybody in the family. So Joseph didn't show a lot of discretion. He perhaps was a little egotistical. He was the favored one in the family. But he definitely turned out to be a man with some true character too. And we're going to see more about that as the story unfolds. But his brothers were jealous of him, but it says his father kept the saying in mind. That reminds me a lot of, I think it's Luke's account that says that Mary, the mother of Jesus, she kept in mind what had happened to Jesus, to think about it and to remember these different significant events in his life. So Jacob is going to remember that long before Joseph ends up saving the entire family by being number 2 to Pharaoh, that the dream of this truth had come to Joseph and God had revealed it to him. And neither Jacob nor his sons believed that this was a possibility. Let's continue on, John.
Let's resume at verse 12. Now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem, and Israel said to Joseph, "As you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I am going to send you to them." "Very well," he replied. So he said to him, "Go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me." Then he sent him off from the valley of Hebron. When Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering around in the fields and asked him, "What are you looking for?" He replied, "I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are grazing their flocks?" "They have moved on from here," the man answered. "I heard them say, 'Let's go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. But they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. "Here comes that dreamer," they said to each other. "Come now, let's kill him and throw him in one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. "Let's not take his life," he said. "Don't shed any blood. Throw him into this cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him." Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty. There was no water in it. Bruce, what is this very specific role we see Reuben playing in this passage?
Yeah, it's interesting. Why is it Reuben that decides to try to save his brother from the wrath of the rest of the brothers? Well, it's because he's the oldest. He's expected to be the prime inheritor of what his father has. But unfortunately, Reuben has already disappointed his father and disgraced himself by a sexual liaison where he had an encounter with Bilhah, one of the wives of his father. And this brought great disgrace on him and in his father's eyes. So perhaps he's thinking to himself, I'll try to recover my father's good favor. I'll protect his favored son, and I'll not let the brothers kill him. So initially, Reuben persuades them not to kill him because their initial thought was, let's just kill him right now. But he persuaded them not to and said, well, no, let's just capture him and throw him down this cistern, which was a dry cistern. Now, again, we're not used to the geography and weather of that part of the world, but about 6 months out of the year or so, it rains, and then a little less than 6 months, it rains almost none at all. And so what happens is during the rainy season, you don't have to go very far for the flocks to eat grass, etc. But then as the end of summer comes, you've eaten up most of the good grass. And now, without a lot of rain, it doesn't rain much in the fall, especially through to December. And so you're forced to take your flocks and go long distances to try to find some food for them. So this was the occasion in which the father was concerned about them, sent Joseph to find out how they were doing. And of course, he goes to where they're supposed to be. They're not there. He's sent on. But of course, all this leads to the terrible end that they see him coming from afar off. That ornate coat he has, they can see at a distance, and they plot to kill him. By the way, in the Hebrew, there's only two places in the Bible this Hebrew word for ornate coat. Sometimes it's called a many-colored coat. We really don't know. It was some kind of unique, special cloak that he had, but what it was exactly, we don't know. One other time it occurs, and this time it has to do with a woman in Samuel and what she was wearing. So we don't really know exactly what it was. But the point wasn't exactly, was it many-colored? Was it some other kind of ornate coat? But the point was nobody else had a coat like that. But Jacob gave this special token of honor to Joseph, and the brothers saw him coming at a distance and plotted to destroy them. And so that's where we are when we pick up the rest of the story.
Thank you, Bruce. Let's pick up at verse 25. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." His brothers agreed. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the cistern and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. He went back to his brothers and said, "The boy isn't there. Where can I turn now?" Then they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They took the ornate robe back to his father and said, "We found this. Examine it to see whether it is your son's robe." He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave." So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of his guard. Bruce, Jacob's name means the deceiver. What dysfunction do we see in this family here, based on that?
Yeah, when your first name is a deceiver, and you basically plot to take away the blessing and the number one place in the family from your brother and succeed at it, that was Jacob's character in his early years. And of course, it caused him to have to leave the family and run for his life. And then he ended up in the hands of a relative, Laban, that ended up being a bigger deceiver and manipulator than he was, where he got manipulated into marrying two sisters when he just wanted to marry one. And then he hardly was able to escape and go back to his father because of Laban. So Jacob was a deceiver. you can see it was kind of went with the family, his mother's side of the family. But here we see Jacob's sons are a bunch of deceivers. They're going to kill their brother, and they come up with a clever way to cover it up. So, something we don't oftentimes think about is our sins can pass down multi-generationally. Our kids don't even have to know. Maybe by the time some of the kids knew Jacob, he changed his ways and was not the deceiver he was. But we see this family dysfunction and sin coming out in these brothers as they pull the wool over Jacob's eyes about his son. Now, of course, interesting, it starts off with Reuben standing up saying, let's not kill him, let's throw him in the cistern. Then Reuben evidently went off to check on the flocks. He comes back, and meanwhile, Judah kind of comes forward as the leader of the group, and he recommends, listen, why should we kill our brother when we can make a profit? We'll sell him to the Ishmaelites. They're on their way to Egypt, and we'll get 20 shekels for him. And we don't even have to kill him. We can just send him on his way. And so he persuades the brothers, and when, of course, Reuben comes back, he's shocked. He doesn't realize what's happened. Instantly, everything goes into hyperdrive. How are we going to conceal what we've done from our father and make him think that his son is dead? So they come up with a clever idea. We'll tear up his robe, and then we'll throw animal blood on it, and we'll bring it back to Jacob and ask him a question. Well, do you know whose this coat is? And of course, they knew he would recognize it. What evidently they didn't anticipate was the depth of misery and mourning that Jacob would have over the loss of his son. So they all went in to try to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and continued to weep and mourn. So he truly loved Joseph, and for his thinking, Jacob said, I've lost my son. A wild animal has torn him apart. And so that's where he thinks he's been left, because he's been deceived. The deceiver gets deceived by his own children into thinking his favorite son has been mauled by animals and is dead. But of course, at the end, it just tells us a little folk, oh, by the way, the Ishmaelites, which of course were distant relatives, all the way back to Abraham's first son, their descendant, who also evidently were involved with Midian, which is more an Arabic tribal Bedouin people. An Ishmaelite group among them was traveling, bringing valuable trade to Egypt. And it tells us that they successfully sold Joseph into slavery, not just to anyone, but they identified as Potiphar, an official of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. So a very prominent official in the hierarchy of Pharaoh. And then, of course, it stops, and it won't return to the story and for a full chapter. But at this point, the general outlay of the land has been formed. We see this dysfunctional family has acted out in the worst possible way, and terrible things seem to be done. So think of the irony of this. Eventually, Israel will end up being slaves in Egypt. But the forefathers sold one of their brothers to be a slave in Egypt long before the rest of the family was enslaved. So think of the terrible irony of this behavior. But then we have this very unusual interlude in chapter 38 that we'll try to make sense of as John continues to read for us.
At that time, Judah left his brothers and went down to stay with a man of Adullam named Hira. There Judah met the daughter of a Canaanite man named Shua. He married her and made love to her. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son who was named Er. She conceived again and gave birth to a son and named him Onan. She gave birth to still another son and named him Shelah. It was at Kezib that she gave birth to him. Judah got a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, "Sleep with your brother's wife and fulfill your duty to her as a brother-in-law to raise up offspring for your brother." But Onan knew that the child would not be his, so whenever he slept with his brother's wife, he spilled his semen on the ground to keep from providing offspring for his brother. What he did was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death also. Judah then said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, "Live as a widow in your father's household until my son Shelah grows up," for he thought he may die too, just like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in his father's household. Bruce, why is Judah's story important enough to be told here?
Yeah, we have to keep in mind the later history of Israel. This was a book that was passed on, and the stories that were included had significance in the life of the people of Israel over time. And if you remember, it's Judah that was the eventual largest tribe that survived the exile and finally returned to the land. And that's where we get the name Jew, comes from an offshoot of Judah. So Judah ends up being the one long-term surviving tribe. And so they'd be interested to know about their forebearer many years ago. But also keep in mind that the king comes from the line of Judah. So David is going to be a descendant of Judah. So these two things, the king and this being the most prominent tribe that survives the exile and over the years, would be why I think this story might be included, where others, there may have been many other oral stories that were not included. But here, it tells us something interesting if you think about it. Again, we have to put ourselves in an ancient mindset. The big issues have been made of the father selecting an appropriate bride for his sons. And in the ancient world, almost all marriages were, arranged marriages. It had to do with what your parents did to arrange for you to marry somebody. There was a bridal gift and all kinds of things went on, part of the customs of that time. But we see Judah simply left the rest of the family. So Judah is being very independent from the rest of the family. He decides to go off and work with a Canaanite man. He sees a Canaanite woman that he wants to marry, so he marries her. He has 3 kids. You have to keep in mind, this is not the way, a proper way of finding a wife. And of course, some disastrous things occur because of this. You have to keep in mind, when you marry a Canaanite woman, maybe she raises the kids to be more pagan than you, who have some faith based on your family of origin, as Judah did. He had 3 sons, which seemed like a blessing. Had 3 sons from an ancient perspective. So he selects a wife, Tamar, to marry his oldest. And then the biblical text says, it does a lot of things. It says a cryptic saying, he was wicked in the sight of the Lord. Well, exactly how was he wicked in the sight of the Lord? It doesn't tell us. However, later on, when it talks about kings or others, and it uses this particular expression, oftentimes it has to do with idolatry or some kind of practices or immorality that's associated with idolatry. And so it wouldn't be surprising Judah marries an idolatrous woman of the Canaanite people, that the sons might be highly influenced, and they marry other Canaanite women. But we find out that God was so displeased, he took his life. Now, then something very unusual happens that we might think this is really weird. But for a person of the ancient Middle East, they would think this would be completely normal. And that is, it was a custom, and we find this in a number of writings from Hammurabi's Code to others, that in the ancient world, if a woman married one son of a family, and before they could have children, if he passed away, it became the responsibility of some other son to come in and to provide offspring. Now, we would think that would be a weird thing to do, but you have to put yourself in the ancient world's position. It had economic and social meaning. For example, how do you think an older woman ended up supporting herself in her old age? Think she waited for her Social Security check to come in? Was she going to be able to work, get a job as administrative secretary down at the bar? There were no jobs outside the home. And your children were your Social Security plan. You lived with them in your old age. Well, what if you didn't have children? Well, you were either forced into prostitution, or if you were too old for that, you were forced into destitution. And we see this is the kind of drama that was going on for Tamar. So, first of all, Jacob does the right thing. He gives her to his second son, Onan, but he's a dishonorable character. Again, it seems to be the issue. If he gave birth to a child to Tamar, then this would be the son of his older brother. Therefore, his children would have preference over Onan's children. So Onan's thinking, well, I don't want to give my brother preference. Now I'm the number one son, so I don't want to do that. So he intentionally didn't impregnate Tamar. But then because of this wicked act, God killed him. Well, at this point, Jacob, of course, wrongly concludes the problem was Tamar. And so he decides, I'm not giving my youngest son. Besides, he must have been relatively young. And so instead he said, go home to your family and maintain your status as a widow. And when the younger son gets old enough, I'll let you marry him. But he evidently had no intention of that ever happening, which meant that, of course, first of all, she had to go back and live with her family. She was condemned to widowhood. He didn't give her the right to potentially remarry. He instead condemned her to widowhood. So she didn't have an option to get married unless Jacob decided to give his youngest child. And it became apparent over time that wasn't going to take place. And so think of what would have happened to Tamar if she just let things play out the way it was. Well, her parents at some point would no longer be able to support her. They would die, and she would be destitute, or she would have to depend on the largesse of her family, and we don't know anything about her family, but it would be very unusual that they would take care of her. So she was in a dramatic situation. That's why they had this custom, so that a woman would have children that could help take care of her when she got to her old age. But that was not going to happen unless there was some intervention. And so the story gets even weirder.
Picking up at verse 12, after a long time, Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, died. When Judah had recovered from his grief, he went up to Timnah, to the men who were shearing his sheep, and his friend Hira the Adullamite went with him. When Tamar was told, your father-in-law is on his way to Timnah to shear his sheep, she took off her widow's clothes, covered herself with a veil to disguise herself, and then sat down at the entrance of Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that though Shelah had now grown up, she had not been given to him as his wife. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. Not realizing that she was his daughter-in-law, he went over to her by the roadside and said, "Come now, let me sleep with you." "And what will you give me to sleep with you?" she asked. "I'll send you a young goat from my flock," he said. "Will you give me something as a pledge until you send it?" she asked. He said, "What pledge should I give you?" "Your seal and its cord and the staff in your hand," she answered. So he gave them to her and slept with her, and she became pregnant by him. After she left, she took off her veil and put on her widow's clothes again. Meanwhile, Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adulamite in order to get his pledge back from the woman, but he did not find her. He asked the men who lived there, "Where is the shrine prostitute who was beside the road at Enaim?" "There hasn't been any shrine prostitute here," they said. So he went back to Judah and said, "I didn't find her. Besides, the men who lived there said, there hasn't been any shrine prostitute here." Then Judah said, "Let her keep what she has, or we will become a laughingstock. After all, I did send her this young goat, but you didn't find her." About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Your daughter-in-law, Tamar, is guilty of prostitution, and as a result, she is now pregnant." Judah said, "Bring her out and have her burned to death." Bruce, what was Tamar's plan here?
She was again another clever deceiver. So the deceiver gets deceived over and over again. But let's kind of put this in a context. First of all, Judah's wife died. So he's now unmarried. He takes a business trip with a good buddy of his. And unfortunately, sometimes men that take business trips away from their home, they're away from everybody that knows them, they don't necessarily behave themselves the way they would in their hometown around where everybody knows who they are. And so Jacob thinks he spotted a prostitute. And of course, Tamar, having assessed the situation, thinks that she can tempt him by dressing as a prostitute. And she is successful in that. But the fullness of that doesn't come to our understanding till later. But again, she says, "What are you going to pay me?" And he says, "Well, what do you want?" And so she said, "Well," he said, "I'll give you a goat." "Well, young goat," which would be a generous payment. But how do I know you do it? You've got to give me something to hold on to till, you bring that to me, so I'll know it's true. "Well, what do you want me to give you?" "Well," she very cleverly said, "I want your signet that's on evidently a rope and your staff." Now, why those two things? In the ancient world, people had either signet rings or signet stones that had a unique symbol that either had the name of the person or something else in it that made it distinct. And so when they would make jars of things, they put their imprint in it so you know who's that belonged to. And you would use that to make an imprint on a document if you made some sort of transaction that would show you and your signet had been embedded. And we find hundreds of thousands of broken signet things all over Palestine, where they've been on various documents, they've been on various pieces of pottery that identified various owners. And so this was an important thing that was so distinctive, you couldn't say, "That's not my signet ring. That's not my signet." Everybody knew you're unique. And your staff oftentimes was built unique and probably had something unique written into it so that others would recognize this is Jacob's staff. So she took these two prominent things, supposedly as a pledge, until he sent the calf, but she had a whole nother plan in mind. So she was a very clever deceiver, but she was in desperate circumstances. And so she connived a way to solve her desperate, childless situation. And as you began to read a little bit, let's, why don't we finish? We pick up verse 29 and just read to the end of the chapter.
Okay. Verse 29. But when he drew back his hand, his brother came out, and she said, "So this is how you have broken out. And this is how you have broken out." And he was named Perez. Then his brother, who had the scarlet thread on his wrist, came out, and he was named Zerah. And Bruce, did you want me to read it from 25 or?
Yeah, let's see. I think it should have been verse 29. I don't know whether we lost. I think you got kind of the end of the story.
Right. So let me go back to verse 25, and I'll read it back
That means that's what I mean.
from 25. We ended at Judah said, "Bring her out and have her burned to death."
Right.
So picking up at verse 25, as she was being brought out, she sent a message to her father-in-law. "I am pregnant by the man who owns these," she said, and she added, "See if you recognize whose seal and cord and staff these are." Judah recognized them and said, "She is more righteous than I, since I wouldn't give her to my son Shelah." And he said, and he did not sleep with her again. When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. As she was giving birth, one of them put out his hand. So the midwife took a scarlet thread and tied it on his wrist and said, "This one came out first." But when he drew back his hand, his brother came out, and she said, So this is how you have broken out." And he was named Perez. Then his brother, who had the scarlet thread on his wrist, came out, and he was named Zerah. So, Bruce, so here, what is the significance of twins in this passage?
Yeah, it's interesting how this whole drama ends up. Tamar's clever deceit of Jacob. I love the part here. Here, Jacob, who left town, slept with a prostitute, is now finds out that Tamar is pregnant, and he's full of self-righteous rage. Let's kill that. Let's burn her to death and bring her out. We're going to punish her. And then she says, "Well, before you do that, let me show you who the man was that did this." And of course, gave the distinctive signet and staff that was Jacob's. And Jacob, he was forced to admit, "You're more righteous than me." However, I would suggest neither one of them were particularly righteous in this story. And that reminds us of a very fundamental truth. And that is that most of the human beings that we read about in the Bible are not heroes, and they're not presented as moral exemplars that we should follow. They're presented as sinful, fallible, dysfunctional people like normal people are. And the only hero in the Bible is God. And so that's why even the great ancestor Judah, of the great tribe of Judah, is presented in a not very positive light, a kind of humbling story for the Judites later on. But at least he acknowledges it, doesn't try to kill Tamar or in any other way harm her, and then tells us about her birth, which is interesting because there are only twice, I think, in the Bible that talks about a woman having twins. And remember, the other one was Jacob and Esau. And so it's just interesting that here it's continued on one more generation. And And here we see, though, it's with Tamar, who through Jacob now has twins. And it's, a clever story. The hand is, as she was giving birth, the hand of one of the babies, they put a little ribbon on him, and it goes back in. Then the other baby makes it out first. And of course, that may seem all inconsequential to us, but in the ancient world, the firstborn was the one who got the family inheritance. He got a double portion of everything and was the official person in charge. So even if you were twins, it's who's out first determines the rest of your future. Now, of course, we realize by looking at the biblical story, even though that was the tradition of the people at that time, God constantly turned that particular understanding on its head over and over again. But here, that's why they're so concerned about who's first and who's getting out and not in time. And they're given their distinctive names based on this birthing drama that Tamar has. Now, we might say, well, how significant is this story? Why would we even remember that? I'm sure by the New Testament, they've forgotten all about this. Not so. Not so. Let's look at the genealogy of Jesus found in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 1. John, will you read for us just the first 6 verses of that genealogy?
This is the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, Judah the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar, Perez the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, Ram the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab, Boaz the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth, Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of King David. David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife.
Yeah. So isn't it interesting? In the genealogy of Jesus, the women that are highlighted in the story are not the more honorable women, but sometimes the less honorable. And they're all non-Israelite women. And so as a descendant of this particular child, it highlights Tamar and her 2 sons. And then the line goes through Perez. And then we go down, eventually we run into Ruth. We have the whole book of Ruth, but she marries into that line, but she's not an Israelite woman, but goes with her mother-in-law back with her to her homeland, ends up marrying Boaz. And then we have the father of Jesse, and of course, then being David, and then David has a child through Bathsheba, who was another man's wife, Uriah. So it's interesting that it highlights this story. And I think part of the reason for that is, Jesus didn't have a perfect family tree. It was marred with many things, but one of them was not all of his ancestors were Jewish. Matter of fact, as we know, several of the women were not Jewish in the line of King David, but no one said David couldn't be a king because he didn't have a pure Jewish heritage. And by the way, the Jews, even to this day, determine your Jewish heritage by your mother, not by your father. And so by this, King David wasn't a Jew, but that, of course, was not true. And so we see that Jesus also comes and becomes someone who brings the good news message to the poor and to the sinners and brings hope to them. And the people he has conflict with are the self-righteous who think they're better than the rest of people. And so we see this drama pulled out of the Old Testament all the way into the genealogy of Jesus. to remind us of the sordid and many-faceted turns of the lineage of King David and later the lineage of Jesus. And of course, you don't have to have perfect parents. You don't have to have a perfect lineage to be a righteous person. And Jesus was able, of course, to be the most righteous of all, the only sinless man that has ever lived. And so with that, we'll conclude this part of Genesis, and we'll pick up with the Joseph story next week. John, you want to close us out with a word of prayer?
Yes. Let us pray. Father in heaven, once again, we are grateful to be able to learn another portion of your word and insights by our teacher, Bruce. And as we look at Genesis with fresh eyes, we're so grateful that we can see not characters of a story, but actual people in history. Father, we ask that you continue to bless us as we seek to be closer to you through study and the knowledge of your word. We thank you for all who are in attendance, both here and who will be watching the recorded version of this. Bless us, keep us, and guide us. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you.